The clock on the bulkhead read midnight. July 23rd, 1945. And this is where the real danger begins. The USS Barb had crawled into the dangerously shallow waters of the enemy bay, just 900 yards from the Japanese coastline. But here's the kicker. The water was so shallow that if the submarine was spotted, it couldn't submerge to hide. It was a sitting duck. Mark this down. The 8 chosen sailors, carrying a heavy 50-pound explosive charge, silently lowered their rubber boats into the freezing, pitch-black water. They were leaving the safety of their ship, paddling directly into the heart of the Japanese Empire. They rowed in total silence, avoiding floating naval mines, until their boots finally hit the rocky beach of Karafuto. Pay close attention to this. For the first time in the entire war, American boots were on the ground of a Japanese home island, and it gets even crazier. The men quickly secured their boats and began creeping through the dense brush toward the train tracks. Suddenly, the shadow of a Japanese guard tower appeared in the mist. The sailors froze, holding their breath, listening to the distant footsteps of an enemy sentry. One wrong move, one clink of a tool, and a swarm of fanatical soldiers would descend upon them. But notice the icy calm of these American boys. Once the sentry passed, they sprinted to the tracks and went straight to work. Think about that for a second. They weren't just planting a standard timer bomb. Their engineer had designed a brilliant mechanical pressure switch. They began digging furiously under the steel rails, placing the micro switch directly beneath the heavy tie. And here is the absolute genius of the trap. The bomb would not detonate by a clock. It would detonate when the massive weight of the train itself pushed the rail down onto the switch. The Japanese would literally pull their own trigger. But right as they were tightening the final bolt, a blinding light appeared in the distance. Listen closely to the intense panic of that moment. A steam locomotive was already coming down the tracks, early, catching the sabotage team completely exposed. The ground began to vibrate. The blinding headlamp was cutting through the fog, moving fast. The sailors didn't run. They scrambled to throw dirt and gravel over the explosives, camouflaging the site in a matter of seconds, and dived into the tall grass beside the tracks just as the massive iron engine roared past them. But here is the real twist. The train didn't explode. The switch was set for a heavier freight convoy, not this light passenger engine. The train passed safely, leaving the sailors shivering in the dark, their hearts pounding, but safe. They knew their time had completely run out. They sprinted back to the beach, pushed their rubber boats into the surf, and paddled like madmen toward the waiting submarine. And that's exactly where the magic happens. They had just climbed back onto the deck of the USS Barb when Commander Fluckey looked through his binoculars. Another train was approaching. This was the big one. A massive, multi-car military transport loaded with heavy munitions. What happened next would be talked about in naval academies for the next 80 years. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, the heavy Japanese freight train hit the exact spot where the American farm boys had dug. And that is the ultimate explosion. A massive, blinding white flash shattered the night sky. The 50-pound charge detonated, which instantly ignited the train's own cargo of artillery ammunition. Listen to the sheer scale of this destruction. The engine boiler blew apart, throwing pieces of shattered iron 1,200 feet into the air. 12 supply cars derailed, folding into each other like a deck of cards, exploding in a chain reaction that lit up the entire coastline like daytime. Commander Fluckey, standing on the bridge of his submarine, could feel the shockwave wash over the water. He didn't waste a single second. He ordered the sub to record the destruction and yelled, "Man the battle stations! Let's get out of here!" The USS Barb slipped back into the deep ocean, leaving the Japanese military completely paralyzed, looking for an invading army that was already gone. When the submarine returned to port, the crew proudly painted a small, smoking locomotive right onto their official battle flag, marking the only time a submarine sank a land train in the history of warfare. Mark this down. It wasn't just a victory. It was a testament to the raw audacity, independence, and unmatched creativity of the American sailor. And that is exactly why the enemies of freedom could never truly understand the mind of Detroit. In the darkest, coldest depths of the Pacific Ocean, in the summer of 1945, the Empire of Japan was burning. And that's where things get interesting. The American war machine had already systematically crushed their surface navy, shattered their air force, and isolated their home islands from the rest of the civilized world. But here's the kicker. The fanatical high command in Tokyo refused to surrender. They were dug in, waiting, desperate to inflict an apocalyptic price on any American soldier who dared to step foot on their sacred soil. They thought they knew every single tactic the United States military could throw at them. But they were completely wrong. They didn't count on a rogue, audacious, and utterly fearless crew of an American Gato-class submarine called the USS Barb. Mark this down. Under the command of a legendary, forward-thinking commander named Gene Fluckey. The USS Barb was not just hunting enemy transport ships anymore. They were rewriting the entire rulebook of naval warfare right under the nose of the Emperor. Commander Fluckey was the pure definition of American resourcefulness. Pay close attention to this. He didn't look at a submarine as a defensive weapon designed to hide in the shadows. To him, the USS Barb was a predatory extension of Detroit's industrial might. He had already modified his submarine to carry massive, experimental rocket launchers, using them to rain absolute hellfire down on Japanese factories, ports, and coastal military bases. Think about that for a second. A submarine, acting like a shore bombardment battleship. The Japanese military analysts were losing their minds, completely unable to comprehend where these devastating rocket attacks were coming from. But here is where the story gets truly insane. By July of 1945, the USS Barb was patrolling the freezing, heavily guarded waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, near the coast of Karafuto, a strategic island deep inside Japanese territory. Listen closely to this. Commander Fluckey was peering through his periscope, watching the rocky shoreline through the fog, when he noticed something highly unusual. Moving through the mist, right along the edge of the beach, was a massive, heavy-duty Japanese freight train. It was loaded to the absolute brim with military supplies, reinforcements, and heavy ammunition, bound for the defense of the mainland. And that is exactly where the magic happens. Any ordinary submarine commander would have looked at that train, noted it in the logbook, and moved on to find a target in the water. After all, submarines sink ships, not trains. But notice the absolute genius of the American spirit. Fluckey turned to his executive officer, smiled, and uttered a sentence that sounded completely suicidal. He said, "We're going to go ashore, and we're going to blow up that train." But here is the real crisis. No American combat troops had ever landed on the actual home islands of Japan at this point in the war. If these sailors were caught, they wouldn't just be killed, they would be captured, tortured, and executed as spies. And it gets even crazier. to pull off this impossible heist. Fluckey needed volunteers. He didn't order his men into danger. Instead, he asked for 8 sailors, specifically men who had been farm boys, scouts, or hunters back home in the United States. Look at the audacity of this strategy. He needed men who knew how to move silently through the dark, men who understood land navigation, and, above all, men who knew how to handle tools under extreme pressure. And here is the ultimate twist. Among the 8 men selected was a brilliant, quick-thinking engineer who suggested using an explosive device that nobody in the Navy had ever tested on land before. They weren't just going to plant a bomb. They were going to invent a brand new, mechanical trap that would force the Japanese Empire to destroy their own prize transport. But as the submarine began to creep silently through the shallow, mine-infested waters toward the enemy beach, everything was about to go horribly wrong.